Thank you, everyone. Well, this is a research, it's an article in collaboration with other Chilean scholars from the law school of Universidad Austral de Chile, Alberto Coddou, and also an independent researcher who is like a trade union advisor in Chile, Cristian González, who was very helpful to understand the union strategies around this interesting case. It's a narrow case, super specific compared to like the last presentation, of course. So today I'm going to present this case on the disputes on labor regulatory space in the context of technological change and organizational change, restructuring on the retail sector. Specifically, I'm going to talk about the employer strategies in the Chilean retail sector. So basically, the starting point is how the labor law focus. Well, I'm not expert, like Alberto is an expert like on labor law regulation, but not myself. But in general, the focus has been placed on adapting the decent labor standards to the gig economy, to the platform economy, especially in the last years, in all these future of work debates. But there has been like less attention on traditional sectors such as retail. So now we are like witnessing some technological changes that are affecting traditional workplaces, including supermarkets, stores, distribution centers. And one of the cases that like raised our attention was in the case of retail and supermarkets. So they started to implement functional flexibility schemes in a context of like the introduction of new technologies. We're following a regulatory space approach which emphasize how the different actors are trying to shape the regulation and compete to influence the labor regulation that arise in the context of technological change. So basically, the idea is to articulate the debates on labor regulation with employment relations and technological change. I'm coming from like an industrial relation school in general, so we're trying to kind of like set up some bridges with the social legal studies that are behind the regulatory spaces approach. And specifically, I want to illustrate the employer strategies in the context of these changes, how they are complying with the law, how they are basically playing with the interpretation of the law so they can pursue their transformation agendas. So first of all, well, regulatory fragmentation in the face of digitalization. In the case of retail, they've been like a long-standing transformation, discounted retailers, but they have accelerated in recent years, especially with the development of e-commerce and the implementation of new omni-channel sales strategies. And I'm talking about self-checkout, cash recyclers, and the new online inventories that are connecting the stores with the warehouses and the distribution centers. So basically, in the last year, these trends have been accentuated, and the regulations have been kind of like trying to catch up with all these transformations. But we know that there are some consequences for labor that are like basically extensive monitoring or supervision, increased organizational flexibility, and intensification of work in general. So basically now the idea is how can we regulate all these changes in terms of like also the enforcement challenges. So basically the regulatory spaces approach, it's about how the different actors try to influence and compete to influence the rules and the political agendas behind the regulation of different spaces. In this case, we're talking about employment relations. So in this case, there are various actors, including managers, trade unions, local governments, consulting firms, could be also social organizations as well, that are mobilizing their power resources in order to shape the rules on what's going on. In this case, the transformations in retail. And this major organizational restructuring process, in the case of retail, the new self-checkouts, the new logistics technologies that are reorganizing the staff in the stores in general, are giving rise to normative gaps in general, where formal legal regulations are sometimes absent or they are not that precise. So obviously there are a lot of problems of interpretation and enforcement as well. So in this context, powerful employers can deviate from established norms by operating within gray areas through what is called institutional toying strategies or loophole entrepreneurship, which means playing with the borders of the law and the interpretation where there is no clear regulation about specific labor standards. So I'm going to present the case of a multinational retailer in Chile. Chile, as many of you may know, is well known as like a hierarchical market economy, which means that they are just a bunch of powerful companies controlling different sectors. And in the case of retail, it's the same. I'm starting with one of like actually the leader of like the retail value chain in Chile and also globally. It controls around 50% of the food retail market share in Chile. And this in a context of absolutely decentralized employment relation system where you can just bargain at the workplace level. And there are also high levels of union fragmentation, which means that a lot of unions can bargain with the same employer within the workplace. So you can imagine that is quite patchy in terms of like there are so many collective agreements between different unions and the same employer. And at the workplace level, not like on a sectoral level, not even a national level. And also there are some legal restrictions to negotiate decisions related to the labor process organization. So the unions can negotiate and bargain around wages, labor conditions like working hours, health and safety, training, but like every decision related to the labor process organization, there are a lot of restrictions. So basically, when it comes to organizational restructuring, the unions are like, they have limited power to negotiate with the employer. In the case of the company specifically, there are high levels of labor turnover, high levels of union density, but with high level fragmentation. There are more than 200 unions within this case study, which is like this big retailer that I'm studying. But in this kind of like a problematic context, a Chilean context, at least we have like a kind of like a strong law enforcement system, which been like improving in the last decades, especially back in the 90s and early 2000s. They have been expanding the labor courts and the labor inspectorates in the different regions and localities in Chile, professionalizing the labor directorate in general, and also the Court of Appeals, the Supreme Court, and in regard to the employment law is quite well advanced. So obviously, as we are going to see, this is going to be like the leverage for the unions in general. So basically, in terms of methodology, I'm looking specifically for this paper to a change program, which is called Task by Process, a multifunctional flexibility program that is basically restructuring the workplace in retail, in supermarkets, led by this Chilean subsidiary, this Chilean retailer. I'm following two qualitative data collection based on like documentary review from these years, encompassing from 2019 to 2023, basically including collective bargaining agreements, labor court rulings, the different court rulings, also the rulings from the labor inspectorate, and the media coverage, newspaper coverage about all this conflict. Also semi-structured interviews with the various actors involved in the regulatory conflict, which includes managers, trade union leaders, shop supervisors, also workers and state regulatory agents, including the inspectors, some of the head of the labor inspectorate as well, training and certification officials, and also some authorities from the Ministry of Labor. So what is this plan about? Basically, this functional flexibility plan is trying to convert every single specialized position in the supermarket into like a multitasking position, which is called store operator. And they are doing that, like getting rid of the old bonuses that the cashiers used to have, like the sales bonuses, for example, and without any wage incentive. So it's been quite problematic, and disputed by the different workers. And according to manager, this plan is based on store logistics and sales and payment technologies, which in general have been helping to modernize the supermarket, saving working time, and streamlining operational processes. So there is no need to have like specialized workers in different sections of the supermarket anymore. That's the rationale of the manager narrative in general. And they are also using a new app to allocate the different shifts and tasks for the worker. The worker basically have this app like on their phones, some of them like on the personal phones, others with like some devices provided by the company, and they can see the list of to-do tasks and the different schedules, which is getting updated every 2 weeks. So obviously these trends of functional flexibility are related as well with all trends in retail, which has to do with a reduction of permanent workers per store in general, and increase of agency workers according to the different seasons of the years, according to on demand. And we can see that like per store, around 20% of like the permanent staff have been reduced, with an increase, like obviously it's variable, but it's around 10% depending on the period of the year. So if we look at the different actors and how they have been reacting to this plan, which is quite polemic in general. First, well, the trade unions, as they don't have like institutional leverage, decentralized collective bargaining system, they are quite fragmented. So the first step was like try to work with each other. They formed like big federations, and they started to basically gather some evidence to present in the labor inspectorate, so the labor inspector can visit the workplace and see that this plan of functional flexibility wasn't working because they were not respecting the security and the clarity regarding the roles and responsibilities that they have to do. Basically, the store managers were like sending them out to cover the different functions in the supermarket without like a coherent criteria. And obviously, they were also complaining about the wage reductions and the work intensification in general, because you have to work like as a cashier, and if there is no clients at all, they can send you out to replenish the shelves or even unload the trucks in the warehouse of the supermarket. And it was like a kind of like a messy plan without a clear structure. Like, for example, every 2 hours you can cover some people in this area. It wasn't like that. So they started to raise the legal problems behind that. And the main strategy was, well, first to collective bargain around these issues. As they couldn't like get any wage adjustment, they started to follow this strategic litigation strategy, which basically is, as I said, like gathering evidence, go to the labor inspectorate and say like, this is a mess. There is no respect at all about like the boundaries of the different tasks that they are asking us to do. And they were also calling for organizational misbehavior. Like, I'm talking about the trade union leaders. Like, they were basically saying to members, please slow down the pace of work because this plan is not working. And if you rush up, if you start to speed up all the time, they will have evidence from the company that this plan is like legal, is coherent, and so on. So basically, that was also a strategy, like an old strategy from like industrial relations tradition, of course. And as they were waiting for like the rules from the Supreme tribunals, in this case, the Supreme Court, they started to also do political lobby to different institutions, including governmental institutions, parliamentarians, and certification, like job certifications institutions, so they can basically pressure them to kind of like generate an atmosphere in Chile that this plan wasn't working at all. So they can kind of pressure the Supreme Court as well, and they are still waiting for the result. In this case, the state agents, in general, they have been favoring like the workers' demands in terms of the ruling, there are two main legal arguments. The first of all is like principles of acquired rights and the primacy of reality, which means basically is you have people working like for so long, or people working in the same position for so long, you can't from like one day to another start to change their positions and asking them to like cover different tasks in the supermarkets. But the main principle, legal principle that they were quoting was about certainty and security, which means if you want to implement this plan, you should be really clear about the boundaries of the different tasks and what are you trying to implement, basically. So they have a prevailing trend of favorable rulings for unions, but they are still waiting for a unified criterion from the Supreme Court to define the legality of the store operate. So obviously, as I mentioned, like the unions have been like pressing other institutions, the training and certification institutions, which are being like kind of like soft regulating the problem, which means like trying to give some advice to the company that they should provide better training and clarify like the different tasks involved in this plan. Also direct intervention from the government to pursue a national enforcement plan regarding this plan. Well, there are also two other main problems that arise. One of them is the use of agency workers to cover some of the tasks in the supermarket. Some of them were hired, then dismissed, and then rehired again to cover the same position. So it was kind of like a breach of the subcontracting law of 2007, and basically was kind of like an institutional toying strategy by the company. And the other one is like the use of workers' data and labor work data in general, to have data around how long does it take to cover this task to perform in different sections, so they can implement this plan like in a better way. But they were not consulted at all. So basically, this is another regulatory concern from the state agents. Okay. And well, from the employer perspective, they are trying to, of course, obstruct the workplace's inspection. So basically telling the supervisors to avoid, for example, talking with the labor inspectors in the workplace. Also, obviously, they took the cases to the courts of appeals, and now they're waiting for the Supreme Court ruling. And political lobby as well, basically trying to argue about the modernization of the supermarket, which is something that you can see everywhere else in the world, but in Chile, according to like the official narrative of the company, they're opposing to something that is already happening elsewhere. So it doesn't make any sense, and that's the main argument. And other institutional toying strategies, as I mentioned, misclassification of workers, like agency workers that are covering central functions, and they are rehired again, dismissed, rehired according to the different seasons, and then the handling and processing of workers' data. So basically, and to wrap it up, you can see how the different actors have been deploying different regulatory strategies, from institutional toying, strategic litigation, and political lobby on the side of the company. Then on the side of the trade unions, strategic litigation, calls to misbehave at work as well, political lobby. And then the different state regulators, including the government, the judiciary power, training institutions. They've been trying to pursue different, like in a patchy way, but different like regulatory strategies, labor law enforcement from the part of the government, like the Ministry of Labor and the Labor Inspectorate, and then from the judiciary, the court rulings, like trying to rule about this complex problem and have a say, and then soft regulation from other institutions related to the government, as like the training agencies and so on. So yeah, the last thing I want to say is just like in this context of accelerating change in a work and institution set in favor of employees, powerful companies can use these regulatory strategies to pursue their own agendas. But employers' regulatory strategies can be contested, like even in unfavorable context like the Chilean one, where you have like so many institutional barriers. as I mentioned, decentralized collective bargaining, restrictions to negotiate around labor process restructuring, and so on. So obviously this kind of is related to how can we basically change the regulations so there could be more dialogue between the different actors in a context where the regulation is so messy and patchy. Yeah, so just want to mention that one of the authors of the article passed away last month, cancer, so I wanted to just dedicate the presentation to him, a trade union advisor, working in retail and other sectors as well for so long. So yeah, this is in his memory as well. Yeah, thank you.